In this lecture, we're going to focus on listening. And like many topics that we cover in an introduction to communication course, listening might come across as this kind of no-brainer kind of thing, right? I mean, we all do this to a certain degree. We're all listeners in some capacity, barring any kind of, disability to actually hear. We still listen as a human, as human beings, but it's important to kind of dive into some of the more specifics because ultimately we want to be better communicators and we definitely need to be better listeners in order to be better communicators. So to start things off, really listening, it's the way in which we learn new information to meet our instrumental needs. It's a way in which we gather information to make decisions, to get actions done, to make choices about things. We need to listen in order to gather the information necessary for us to do things on a daily basis. Listening is also incredibly important for relational maintenance, regardless of the type of relationship, whether that's in a professional context or a family context or, a friendship context or a romantic context. Having effective listening skills and being a good active listener is very important for any of the relationships in which we exist. And then finally, what we don't really maybe think about as much or don't see the connection as much is this idea of our sense of self. Again, we need to listen to gain a better understanding of our identity when we talk about the looking glass self and what's reflected back to us and the messages we receive and how we make sense of those in terms of our identity. Uh, Um, Listening is vital in how we come to understand our senses. And one of the first things that's important for us to distinguish is the difference between hearing and listening. Now, on the surface, these things might sound the same, or you might understand them as the same, but they're actually quite different. Hearing is really just a biological process. It doesn't take any effort on our part. It's not where we're using our brains to actually choose what we're paying attention to. It's just a physiological process. You could be at a concert or a sports game or in the hallway at school or really anywhere, a restaurant, wherever there's a bunch of noise going on, and you're hearing the whole time. Your body, your brain is doing that, again, physiological process of taking, the noise in, but you're not actually processing it or thinking about it too much. Whereas listening is that process. It's the process through which we respond and intellectually and emotionally consider what we're listening to and we evaluate it. And this is just kind of an outline of the listening process in itself. We'll cover this in a little bit more detail one by one. Step one of listening is receiving. And this is where we take in stimuli through our various senses. We tend to think of obviously our hearing as that primary sense, but also when we're talking about listening in terms of the field of communication, it's not just the verbal content that we're picking up, we're also listening to nonverbal actions. When we think of listening, it's more of evaluating what we're seeing. So, again, we've talked about when somebody, it's not what they say, it's the way they say it, it's their body language, it's their eye contact, it's their facial expressions, their gestures, all that kind of stuff kind of falls into the category of listening for us. So through various stimuli, whether that's with our eyes, our ears, even our sense of smell and things like that can sometimes play a role. We take in these stimuli, and what's important to know about this is it's not just that we receive or listen or do this first step of the listening process one time. It's continual and cyclical throughout any kind of interaction. We are continually receiving things. And again, we're doing that whole decoding process of breaking the message down. It's going through our schemata and we're breaking it down. So the very first step is we're receiving the information. We're receiving both the nonverbal and nonverbal stimuli that's coming our way. And we do this quite often throughout the course of any interaction. So the next step after receiving the information is interpreting the information. And again, we got to think back to when we were talking about perception and schemata, right? We all have this kind of blueprint or this scheme in our mind that helps us filter things through. And this is where the interpreting process comes into play. This is where we make meaning out of the information we receive. So we receive all this information, we interpret it, it comes into our through our schemata, through our filter, and at this point we begin to ascribe meaning. Like, what does that mean? We just received this information. Now, what does that information mean to us? And it's important to remember, again, with schemata, different people have different schemata. So even though somebody might be saying the same thing to multiple people, it might be delivered the same way. Their nonverbals are the same, their verbal messages are the same. But since we all have different schemata, it's quite possible that in that interaction, different people hearing and seeing the same things could interpret that information just a little bit differently and make a little bit different of a meaning out of it. Once we move on to the once we receive the information and we interpret it, and another important step to the listening process is our ability to recall that information. Are we able to store the information, and are we able to repeat it back? And this is why a big step in effective listening and being an effective and active listener is your ability to paraphrase when you're speaking with somebody. When you're in an interaction and there's an exchange going back and forth, demonstrating your ability as a good listener, and this is also is just good practice to help you become a better listener. Repeat back to the person in your own words, paraphrase what they just said to you. If somebody says, okay, I think I'm going to go to Meyer and I'm going to grab a few groceries. I think we need milk. I think we need bread. And you say, oh, okay, so you're going to go to the store and you're going to grab some groceries. That little bit of paraphrase right there, that little bit of recalling, just reflecting back to that person, hey, I understood what you said, and I'm just letting you know. That not only makes us an effective listener and a more effective communicator, it makes us better at recalling, and it helps our memory in a lot of ways. I encourage you all to just kind of play a little game. It's pretty fun for a recalling activity. I got the link right here. Go ahead, pause the video, copy and paste this, or type this into a search bar. It's a fun little brain teaser kind of game where it gives you a series of words. You try to memorize them, and it's just kind of fun. So go ahead and do it. It's pretty simple. It'll only take a few minutes. So strongly encourage you, go ahead and pause the video and go play this little brain teaser to kind of work on your recalling ability. After we recall the information, we then evaluate it. So we're at this point, at this stage in the process where we've received the information, we've interpreted it, we've thought about it in a way where we're able to kind of repeat it and state it back, and then we evaluate what we hear. And we evaluate what we hear, or what we evaluate what we listen to in a variety of ways. We tend to judge the credibility, is this factual? Is it not factual? We judge the completeness of it. Like, is there more to the story here? Is there more to say? Have you told enough for this all to come together and make sense? Is it worth listening to? Is this worth me taking action on? Et cetera, et cetera. We evaluate somehow what we listen to make some kind of choice. And when I say make a choice, that means how we respond, whether it's through communication or how we take action based on that information that we heard. One way or another, we do some sort of judgment. We read between the lines, meaning that we all have previous information. We all have previous things stored in our schemata. So we use that and kind of compare it to this new information that we're listening to and receiving. And that's ultimately how that's one way that we'll judge it. We'll judge it based on information we already know. If you're an expert on a particular topic and somebody is talking to you about this topic, you're probably going to compare what they're saying a lot to what you already know. Whereas if you don't know so much about a specific topic and somebody's talking about it, you might not have much of a baseline of comparison or the stored information to compare it to. So you might do this a little less. And then we also value, we judge the value of it, whether this is a good or a bad message. Is it right or wrong? Is it okay or is it not okay? So on and so forth. So in the evaluating stage, we really, really judge, we're kind of at the final steps here. We've taken in the information, we've ascribed meaning to the information, we've repeated it back maybe to ourselves, or we have the ability to repeat it back to who we're speaking to, and then we really, really sit and begin to evaluate it. And I'm not saying this is a long, drawn out process. This is a lot of subconscious, kind of quick action, but these are the steps that take place. And then finally, what we do is we respond when listening. We send verbal and nonverbal messages that indicate attentiveness and understanding, or the lack thereof. So, part of being a good listener is responding while listening. It's giving head nods. It's showing that you're engaged with facial expressions like smiles, or if you're confused, like I don't understand. Good eye contact, head gestures, body movements, all these kinds of things. We'll go over this when we reach public speaking, but it's really, really important to be responsive while listening. It makes the speaker feel more comfortable, and it tends to contribute to a much stronger conversation. So in that video, we see Dwight Schrute trying to learn some effective listening skills here. So if you weren't able to actually see it there in the recording, here's the little link to it. Go check it out. But it really gets at this whole idea of responding, as we were talking about. So now that we've gone over the basics of listening and we've discussed the actual process of listening, I just want to touch on a few more things. And one of those first things being types of listening. There's different situations that call for different types of listening. We don't just listen the same regardless of context. Listening, just like communication, is very much contextually based. So there's a few different types of listening that I want to go over. Discriminative listening is where we're very focused in our listening, and we want to isolate particular things, particular stimuli, whether there's specific auditory or visual stimuli. So it's almost like biased listening to a certain extent. And an example of this would be like when a detective interviews a suspect. They might be looking for all sorts of different things going on. When they ask them a question, the suspect might be saying one thing, but maybe the detective's picking up on a particular nonverbal communication that they're trained on to that they're trained to learn. If somebody is lying or being deceitful or something like that. So again, you can kind of think of discriminative listening as kind of almost like a bias, paying attention to particular things while in an interaction. Listening for information is kind of the opposite of discriminative listening. Listening for information is where you're really just taking in as much as you possibly can and organizing it in a way that makes the most sense for you. We want to try to restrain judgment as much as possible, even if we have preconceived notions or preconceived information about whatever's being discussed or what we're listening to. We want to try to hone in on what the main ideas are or what the main points of what we are listening to are. Try to eliminate, try to filter through everything being said and focus on what the main arguments are. And we want to do that by looking for supporting material. Again, is there information to support this? Is there research? Is there proof? Are there personal examples? Have you experienced something like this? We want to find supporting materials kind of in the quote unquote argument of what we're listening to help identify the main points. We almost start forming a mental outline to kind of piece it together for ourselves with cliff notes. We want to relate things to our own experiences to help us kind of better understand it. We look for similarities and differences with the things that we already know about the topic. And, We also tend to ask questions and paraphrase. Listening for information is where we're just trying to collect as much information as we possibly can on any specific topic. We don't want to be super judgmental about it. We want to try to pull out what the main key arguments or main key points are. We want to look for similarities and differences that we can relate to and know. We try to relate it to ourselves. And again, it's about gathering as much as we possibly can in any given context without trying to be too judgmental or too critical at this point. And a lot of this will take place when we are moving into presentations in the course. When your classmates are giving speeches and presentations, this is the kind of listening you're going to want to implement while those things are taking place. Critical listening, on the other hand, it's not so much discriminative where we are listening or paying attention to particular things, but it's not quite like informational listening where we're trying to take everything in. We're really kind of being more evaluative of what it is that we're listening to. We want to seek information before making any kind of evaluation. Like opinions are nice and they're great, but I want to see facts. I want to see science. I want to see the proof in the pudding that supports what you're saying. We also want to be considering who the speaker is and what their motives are, and you can take this into a variety of different contexts. Say social media or news sources or wherever you're getting your information from. Consider the bias or consider the motives of the author that wrote that piece, or consider the motives of the speaker giving that presentation, or consider the motives of that person that's being interviewed by that news station, and then consider the motives of that news station. If you read some kind of news article in a particular, like New York Times or Washington Post or, Fox or CNN or whatever it might be, learn a little bit about that particular source in which the information is coming from, because that's going to play a key role in what they're saying and how they're framing things. You want to challenge the ideas and question the ideas that are being shared. Don't just go along with them, like a vacuum, like, sure, I'm going to believe everything you're saying. Evaluate things. Work on distinguishing facts from opinions. Don't just accept what you're hearing because somebody's saying it. Do a little bit of research on your own and actually look into the truth that's associated with that. Is there supporting data that's being brought to the table for that argument to make sense and for you to accept it as factual or provable? You need to consider the credentials and the experience. If I give up, me, a communication professor, if I go give a speech about, I don't know, brain surgery, the only thing in that speech that's going to make me credible is the fact that I'm decent at public speaking. I don't know diddly squat about brain surgery. I don't know anything about the science behind it. I have no experience with brain surgery. So if I give up and give a speech about brain surgery, everybody, should be questioning what's his education and how does somebody with a master's, almost PhD in communication know anything about brain surgery? So on and so forth. You want to know the credentials and the experience of either the person or the source in which you're receiving information from. Examine emotional appeals. Does a person actually seem emotionally bought into it? Do they seem like they actually care about what they're talking about? That helps us understand a little bit more in terms of how credible the individual is. And then later on, we assess the messages a little bit more thoroughly. And finally, listening is social support. This is really where we want to restrain judgment as much as possible because we're listening really to help somebody else out. This is where a friend, family member, loved one is going through a tough time. They just lost someone they love. They just lost they just lost a job. They could be experiencing some kind of illness, whatever it might be. This type of listening is kind of significantly different because we really just want to avoid judgment. We really want to pay attention to feelings and the emotions and how the person is feeling, as well as the ideas and the thoughts they're sharing. We really want to strive to talk less with this kind of listening, and we want to listen more to the individual. And we really, really want to focus on using supportive language where we're showing them, I'm here for you, I'm listening to you. We want to ask the right kind of appropriate questions. We want to paraphrase things back to them so that they understand that we understand what they're saying and what they're going through and that we're there for them. So overall, with empathetic types of listening, it's really for social support situations where we're listening to a friend or a loved one in some capacity, or even a colleague or somebody professionally. It's about restraining judgment. It's about showing support. It's about talking less and listening more. And key thing, don't offer advice unless asked. And then when you are offering advice, don't try to offer advice like, I know this is exactly what you got to do. Be a little bit more like, I'm going to provide some options, or this, in my experience, if I were in your shoes, this is what I would do. But don't make them feel restrained by your advice as if you got to do this or you're doing it wrong. Listening styles, I'll briefly go over this. Definitely make sure you're reading this more thoroughly in the text. There's a lot of good information in our book about listening styles, but one of the key things I wanted to point out and make sure people understood is the fact that none of us are one type of listening style necessarily. We can identify as a lot of different listening styles, and some of us probably orient more towards some of these orientations more than others, but it's possible for us to be different types of listeners. There's folks that tend to be more people oriented, where they focus on feelings a lot more. They tend to pick up on the emotional state of others when they're speaking with them, and they might not always capture every little bit and piece of the specific content, but they kind of feel the vibe of the conversation, if that makes sense. There's action oriented, and this takes place a lot in like professional settings, where it's like, I want concise, accurate information. I don't want all the fluff. I don't need all the other stuff. I want to know the specific details I need, and I want to know the information that I'm looking for here. There's content oriented. I kind of tend to lean into this side of things, and it makes sometimes I make things way too complicated because of this. But it's the folks that are analytical. They like to process things. They like to process a lot of complicated information, and sometimes they take the simplest things and just over analyze it. Like my wife says something like, "Well, I'm gonna go hang out with my friend Kara today. Are you fine with that?" Who knows why she asked me if she's fine with that. Maybe she just wanted to make sure I didn't have anything going on today, or I didn't have any expectations for her to help me with anything or anything like that. It could have been something simple, and my response could just be, no, that's totally fine. But sometimes I'll get to thinking, like, why is she asking me if that's okay? What's she gonna go do with Kara? Is there something I shouldn't know about? Sometimes I go down these rabbit holes of just being way too over analytical with things when I'm listening, and I'm sure other people are like that too. There's time oriented listening, and this takes a lot in like small group communication settings, where it's like, okay, we got stuff to do, we're on timelines, we're on time schedules here, give me what I need to do the next step, and then I'll listen to the rest when I'm ready for the next step. So these are just some of the listening styles. Again, your book goes in way more depth. Definitely read that information on listening styles, but I just wanted to briefly touch on some and really emphasize the fact that we can be multiple different types of listeners with different listening styles, but some of us tend to orient or identify with some of these more than others. Just briefly, some barriers to effective communication or effective listening. Noise is a huge one. Noise is really anything in the environment that's screwing you up and making it hard for you to listen to things. The types of different noises, we got environmental and physical noise. That's like if I am like having a conversation with somebody and the TV is on in the background, or there's a radio on, or somebody's outside mowing and you can hear the mower. And that's where there's physical, actual noise that's interrupting with your ears, that you are picking up in terms of hearing, and it's kind of getting in your way because that noise is in the environment. There is psychological noise, and psychological noise are things like you're preoccupied about something. Maybe you just got in an argument with somebody and you're still consumed by that argument. You're thinking about it. Maybe you're stressed out about something else in particular and you're thinking about it. Psychological noise that takes place really when you're preoccupied by something individually in your own brain and your own thoughts, and it's interrupting your ability to listen effectively. Physiological noise, kind of similar to psychological noise, but this is more about things that your body is doing. So like if you're anxious and you're like having maybe like mild panicky kind of feelings, that could interfere with your ability to hear. If you're overheated, like if you're hot and bothered and hot, sweaty and uncomfortable, that makes it hard for you to hear. If you're feeling sick, if you're in pain, really if your body is doing stuff to interfere with your ability to listen, that's called physiological noise. We have cognitive barriers. We've discussed, schemata a lot, but if there's prejudice or this thing called information overload, I'm sure some of you are like me where sometimes you read, and when you read, you might read like 2 or 3 pages in a book, and then you stop and you're like, "Wow, I don't have a damn clue what I just read for these last 2 or 3 pages," and you have to go back and reread it. That happens when we talk. That happens when we're in the middle of communication. Sometimes there's so much information being shared with us that it's too hard for us to even get to the point of selecting it and interpreting it and making a decision about it. So that sometimes messes us up. Another thing to consider, our brains process things a lot quicker than we're able to speak. So often when somebody is saying something to us, we're processing a lot quicker than what they're saying. And that can get us in trouble because we're processing sometimes and arriving at conclusions way too early when we haven't even let the speaker kind of finish speaking. Selective attention is another problem. This is where we only kind of pay attention to what we want to pay attention to, or the things that we're most familiar with stick out to us a lot more. So that's another barrier. And similar to, again, when I was just talking about the fact that we process thoughts faster than we speak, we do this thing called response preparation. And this is where we are when we're having conversations with people. This happens a lot in arguments for those of you that are in relational or romantic relationships or friendships even. This happens a lot in arguments where when you're arguing with somebody, you're kind of preparing your rebuttal before they're even done talking. So response preparation is where we're constantly preparing what we're going to say next before the person that's speaking is even done. And these are all barriers to effective listening. Some more barriers to effective listening, things like egocentrism, where we're so focused on ourselves, we think you're right and the other person's wrong, so I don't want to listen. Lack of interest, if somebody's talking about something we really don't care a whole lot about, we're not going to pay attention well enough. Things like, if you're heard too often, meaning we've heard this same thing over and over again, I don't care anymore. Message overload, we just kind of talked about that. Message and information overload. Preoccupation, again, if you're distracted by something. If you have actual hearing problems, there's a barrier. If you make faulty assumptions, you start making assumptions and conclusions before the person is done talking. If your brain just thinks rapidly, if there's physical distractions, a lack of training and what it means to be an effective listener, kind of like the stuff you're learning in this course. These all represent barriers to effective listening. And just to kind of briefly cover some faulty or bad listening behaviors that you should know. And again, this is brief, but check your textbook for a full list of this. Pseudo listening. This is like fake listening. This is like if my mom, when I'm a little, like when I was a teenager or whatever, if I was in the living room watching TV and my mom would come in and she would start talking to me about something, but I'd still be paying attention to the TV, but I'd say things like, uh-huh, yeah, no, okay, okay, sure, faking it as my mom's trying to talk to me until she gets so mad that she'd get up and turn the TV off. That's pseudo listening. That's kind of faking it. Selective listening, again, we've talked about this a little bit, picking and choosing. Defensive listening takes place when we're preparing an argument or a counter argument, so we don't even really want to listen. Ambushing is where we don't even give the person a chance to say a whole lot and we just start attacking on the smallest thing that we can think of. Insensitive listening is where we're just not truly being empathetic and we're not truly paying attention. Interrupting, that's always rude. We know that. Distorted listening, where we kind of take the information people are sharing with us and purposefully distort it to sometimes make them sound crazy or wrong or just give us an excuse to not agree with them or actually want to listen to. Eavesdropping is a thing that's not cool. Don't listen in on private conversations. Aggressive listening, where we're aggressively trying to listen to things that are going to set us off. Narcissistic listening, where we change the conversation and make it all about us. All things that are bad listening behaviors that we should all be aware of and try to avoid. And that your textbook really goes into this in a lot more depth and provides a lot of information about how to become a more effective listener. So I strongly encourage you to pay a lot of attention to that information in that section of the book. And ultimately, at the end of the day, just some key takeaways, but again, definitely be reading the sections in your book about improving your ability to listen or your listening behaviors. Be active listeners. Again, goes into more depth in the textbook, but display verbal and nonverbal cues to indicate that you are listening. Show people, when your professors are teaching, when somebody's giving a speech, when you're interacting with your friends, when you're in a small group, whatever the setting might be, use your nonverbals, use your facial expressions and your gestures and your body language and all that stuff to show that you are listening, like Dwight in that clip earlier in the lecture. Be critical listeners. Don't just take things in because it's easy for us to just believe what we hear, whether it's from the news or one of our best friends. Evaluate facts and look for credibility. Practice empathetic listening. For some of us, this is easy and this is simple. For others of us, this is really hard. But practice the things that we discussed when it comes to empathetic listening. And finally, remember, gender and culture plays a role in everything communication. And so gender and culture, of course, plays a role in our ability to be good listeners. And again, refer to the textbook. There's some information in there that you're going to want to know when it comes to how gender and culture play a role in listening.